At 2:15 a.m. on January 15, the usual quiet hum of County General's emergency room was disturbed by the steady sound of the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. It wasn't an eerie sound, just a tired mechanical hum that matched the exhaustion of the overnight shift. As a first-year resident, I had learned to tune it out, focusing instead on the patients, the charts, the calls that never stopped coming in. But tonight, something wasn't quite right. I felt it in my bones, even though I couldn't yet put a name to it. Room 209 had been a quiet corner of the hospital, usually reserved for those waiting for a bed in the ICU or patients in need of short-term care. It wasn't a high-traffic room, not one you'd expect to see any strange happenings. That night, though, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, and I wasn't the only one. Dr. Hale, the attending physician for the night, was leaning over the nurse's station, scribbling something on a chart. He looked up, rubbing his eyes. "Did you see him?" he asked quietly, not looking directly at me. His voice wasn't fearful, but there was something in it that was different, as if he were trying to convince himself of something. "Who?" I asked, glancing up from the patient's file I was reviewing. "The guy in room 209, he said, his voice low. "I thought I saw him walking down the hallway just now. You know, the one who came in an hour ago?" I blinked. "What? I thought we pronounced him dead about 4 hours ago." He nodded slowly, a strange, thoughtful look crossing his face. "Exactly. And yet, I swear I saw him looking exactly the same as he did when we found him. But then he disappeared. Just like that." I stood up, unsure of how to respond. It couldn't be him. We'd all worked on the man, an older gentleman who had been involved in a terrible car crash. The trauma was severe, the head injury was catastrophic. There had been no way he could have survived, yet here we were, discussing him as if he were still a living, breathing patient. "Are you sure?" I asked, though I wasn't sure what I was asking. Was I asking if Dr. Hale was losing his mind, or was I asking myself if something supernatural was happening here? He nodded, then leaned closer, lowering his voice further. "You're not the only one, you know. I heard Nurse Simmons mention it earlier. She thought she saw him in the hall, too." The weight of it began to settle on me. It was one thing for Dr. Hale to say it. It was another for Nurse Simmons, a seasoned veteran who never got rattled, to even consider the possibility. I walked toward room 209, my footsteps muffled by the thick hospital carpet. The door to the room was open, and as I approached, I glanced inside. The bed was empty. The sheets were neat, almost too neat, like no one had ever been there at all. But I knew better. We had all been in this room, 4 doctors, 3 nurses, and a respiratory therapist. We had all seen the same thing, a man with head trauma so severe, there was no question of survival. "Dr. Hale," I said, looking back toward the nurse's station, "his bed's empty." He came over to stand beside me, his face unreadable. "I checked earlier. It was empty then too. But we keep seeing him walking the halls. Everyone who's been here tonight has seen him." A chill ran down my spine, though I didn't want to acknowledge it. "Are you sure it's him? Could it be someone else? A different patient?" He shook his head. "It's him. No mistaking it. Same clothes, same hair, same walk. But no one knows where he came from." I felt the hairs on my neck stand on end. We both stood there, staring into the quiet room, and that's when I heard it. Footsteps, faint but unmistakable, coming from the direction of the hall. A slow, deliberate pace, as though someone was strolling calmly toward us. I turned quickly, but the hallway was empty. There was no one there. I shook my head, rubbing my temples. I wasn't the type to believe in ghost stories or hospital folklore. But this was something else entirely. I turned back toward Dr. Hale. We need to check the security footage. Maybe we're missing something. Something logical. He nodded, and we both made our way to the security office, a small, dimly lit room at the back of the hospital. The security guard, a grizzled man named Roy, greeted us with a look of mild confusion. "What's going on?" he asked, leaning back in his chair. "We need to see the footage from the hall outside room 209, I said, my voice firm despite the unease creeping into my stomach. Roy pulled up the video feed from the cameras. We watched the playback, the grainy black and white footage flickering on the screen. It was 2:10 a.m., just 5 minutes before Dr. Hale had seen the patient walking. The hallway was completely empty, no one in sight. I held my breath, waiting for the moment when the man would appear on screen, the one they had all seen. But nothing happened. The footage showed a perfectly still corridor, devoid of any movement. "That's impossible," I muttered, my mind racing. "We saw him. We all saw him. How can there be nothing here?" Roy didn't respond, but I could see the doubt on his face. He rewound the footage to another point. The empty hallway stretched out, the cold, sterile light making everything feel surreal. Still, no sign of the patient. I felt the weight of something heavy pressing on my chest, something I couldn't explain. There had to be an answer, a rational explanation, but in that moment I couldn't find one. "Wait," Roy said suddenly, his finger on the pause button. The frame froze, my eyes narrowed. There, in the far distance, standing at the end of the hallway near the stairwell, was a figure. It was only a shadow, indistinct, but I could swear it was the man from room 209. He stood there for a long moment, and then he wasn't there anymore. A cold shiver ran through me. "That wasn't real," I whispered. "It wasn't real." "Did you see it too?" Roy asked, his voice barely audible. I nodded, though I wasn't sure what I had seen, but something had happened, something that couldn't be explained. The silence in the security room was broken only by the sound of my racing heart. I felt a sudden urge to leave, to walk away from this strange occurrence, to pretend that none of it had happened. But when I turned to leave, Roy's voice stopped me. "You know what's strange?" he said slowly. "Room 209 was closed after that mass casualty incident 20 years ago. They never reopened it. The hospital doesn't even use that floor anymore." I turned to face him, my mind reeling. "What are you talking about? That doesn't make sense. I've been working here for months. Room 209 is still—" "No," he interrupted. "It hasn't been open in 20 years. After the fire, they sealed off the entire wing, and 299 was where the worst of it happened." I stood frozen, my thoughts a blur. What had we seen tonight? Who had we seen? Was it possible that the hospital had forgotten something so fundamental? Or had something more unsettling been lurking in the shadows all along? Room 209 wasn't supposed to exist, but tonight it had called us back, one way or another. If you're enjoying these chilling stories from Bone Chilling Nightmare, don't forget to hit that like button, share this nightmare with your friends, and subscribe for more spine-tingling stories that will keep you up at night. Your support helps us bring you more eerie experiences, and with every share, we get closer to unlocking the next terrifying chapter. Stick around, the next story is just a click away, and trust me, you won't want to miss it. It was almost time for the shift change at St. Vincent's Medical Center. The night was quiet, save for the hum of the machines and the soft shuffle of nurses' shoes on the tile. I'd been working here for over 2 decades, long enough to know the rhythm of the ICU, the patterns that formed, the rare moments of chaos, and the many hours spent in what seemed like a fog of routine. At this hour, just before midnight, there's a certain stillness that hangs over the ward, as if the hospital itself is taking a breath before the dawn. But that night, everything felt off. It was as if the air itself was different. Even the usual murmurs from the hallway seemed to be muffled, swallowed by the sterile walls that kept us separated from the rest of the world. Then came the call. "Code Blue, room 204. Code Blue, room 204," echoed through the overhead speakers, cutting through the stillness like a sharp knife. My heart skipped a beat. Room 204. There was no patient in that room. I paused, glancing over at my colleagues. We all shared the same confused look. It wasn't unusual for rooms to go unoccupied in the ICU. Sometimes a patient would be discharged, sometimes moved to a different unit, but there was always someone assigned to every room. A code blue meant a patient was in immediate danger, and the heart-stopping urgency of it all rattled my bones. I quickly grabbed the emergency bag and rushed toward the room. The fluorescent lights above flickered as I moved down the hall, casting odd shadows that seemed to stretch further than they should have. It wasn't the first time that light had been unreliable here, but tonight it felt different. The shadows looked wrong. They twisted, as if they had lives of their own. I shook off the thought, pushing forward. When I reached the room 204, it was empty, just as I had expected. No patient, no sign of any recent admission. The bed was made up perfectly. The heart monitor standing quietly beside it, and the heart monitor blinking. I glanced at the screen, my breath catching. It was the monitor. Its blaring beeps were unmistakable. It was signaling a code, but there was no patient here. The sound was so sharp, so insistent, like a cry for help, that no one could answer. I quickly grabbed the button by the door and signaled the team. "Code Blue, no patient," I muttered into the intercom. "Get in here now." A moment later, my colleagues arrived, all of us standing in the doorway, staring at the empty room as the equipment continued to pulse with life of its own. The machines blinked and hummed as if in some twisted mockery of normalcy. The ventilator hissed to life, with no one to breathe its air. The infusion pumps clicked, starting and stopping in a regular rhythm. The heart rate monitor fluctuated wildly. It was chaos inside an empty room. "Is someone playing a joke?" one of the nurses muttered, but I could hear the uncertainty in their voice. "No," I said, my voice more certain than I felt. "Something's wrong." We rushed into the room, checking each piece of equipment, expecting to find a malfunction, but everything seemed to be functioning normally. Too normally. The beeps continued, faster now, louder. A sense of dread began to settle over the group, and the cold hospital air felt thicker, as if the walls themselves were pushing in. Then, I saw something that made the hairs on my neck stand up. The monitors flickered, once, twice, and then there, written on the screen in bold letters, "Time of death, 11:59 p.m. I froze. The clock on the wall showed the time as just a few seconds past 11:59, but that was impossible, wasn't it? "Clear the room," I said, voice rising, no longer the calm nurse, but someone trying to keep a lid on something I couldn't name. We all stepped out, my mind racing. There was no patient, no one to die, but the clock was ticking down. I glanced at the wall, counting the seconds. 11:29, 12. Duffin. We stared at each other, bewildered. What in the world had just happened? I had to know more. I left the team behind to check the old patient records in the nearby filing room. My hands were shaking as I flipped through the thick paper files. The hospital had been here for decades, long enough for a whole slew of histories to accumulate. But there, tucked at the back of a dusty old file cabinet, was something I didn't expect. A folder marked Unsolved Cases, one I'd never seen before. I pulled it out, feeling the weight of the papers inside. The first one was a death certificate of a patient who had passed away in room 204, March 3rd, 1993. The time of death? Exactly at midnight. I continued flipping through the pages. Another death. Same room, same night, March 3rd, 1987. Time of death? Midnight. Then another. And another. Each year the same. The records went back decades. Every single death had occurred at midnight. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. My mind was racing, but I couldn't put the pieces together. Why midnight? And why room 204? Then I stopped. There, among the records, was something else. A small handwritten note, barely legible. It said simply, "Full moon. Always the full moon." I blinked, unable to believe what I was seeing. I flipped back through the pages, looking at the dates. March 3rd, every year. And every year, without fail, the deaths occurred during the full moon. I could barely catch my breath. Tonight was the full moon, and it was March 3rd. I rushed back to the ICU, my thoughts a blur. The full moon was rising outside. The machines, the clocks, the deaths. Everything was connected. I was beginning to see it, beginning to feel the weight of the history that this room carried. By the time I arrived back in room 204, I could see the team had already started to pack up the equipment, convinced that whatever had happened was a glitch, a fluke. But I could feel it, deep in my bones, that something had just shifted. The last person left the room, and I found myself alone once more. I stood there for a long moment, listening to the silence, the same silence that had swallowed the hospital before the code blue was called. Suddenly, I felt it, just a faint whisper of cold air against my skin. I looked up at the ceiling, and there it was, a shadow, like a passing figure, flickering in the dim light. It was the kind of thing you could easily dismiss as a trick of the mind, until you felt the hairs on your neck rise, until you realized the hospital was quiet again, too quiet. No machines were beeping, no footsteps, just the quiet hum of the building itself. I closed my eyes, my heart pounding. Somewhere, deep within the hospital's old bones, something was watching, waiting, and whatever it was had made its presence known right here in room 204. And when the full moon rose again, who knew what would happen next? The clock on the wall blinked, 3:33 a.m. In the dimly lit office I had tucked away in the basement of Memorial Hospital's North Tower. The place was silent, save for the hum of fluorescent lights overhead and the faint sound of the ventilation system working its way through the endless maze of hallways. I leaned back in the creaky chair, running a hand through my shoulders. It's another late-night shift, and I'd gotten used to it by now, Long hours, not much to do, just the usual things around the hospital that no one else wanted to deal with. Cleaning, fixing, maintaining. The elevator shafts were part of my responsibility, and it was the damn elevator that would be the reason this night stood out. I had heard the rumors, staff gossip, whispers in the hallways. It wasn't unusual for the place to get creepy at night. The hospital had been around for decades, and with age came oddities, quirks, and, I suppose, strange things that seemed to happen when the place was left to its own devices. Cold spots, strange sounds in the walls, flickering lights, the usual haunting nonsense. But they never bothered me. Not until that night. I'd just finished a round of checking the maintenance logs when I received a call from the night shift nurse. Her voice was shaky, like she'd seen a ghost. "The elevator's been acting up. Stops on the 3rd floor. You need to check it out." The 3rd floor? That floor had been shut down for years. The hospital had closed it for renovations, but never really did anything with it. Just left it there, locked up and unused. Rumor had it that it was closed after some sort of incident a long time ago. Of course, no one could remember the details. I grabbed my toolbox, sighed, and made my way to the elevator. The sound of my boots echoing in the empty corridor felt louder than it should have been. The North Tower was an old beast, and the elevator system was just as ancient. It creaked and groaned when it moved, a symphony of mechanical sounds that made it seem alive somehow. When I reached the elevator, the doors were open, and the little indicator showed that it had stopped on the 3rd floor again. The 3rd floor? That wasn't normal. I pressed the button to call it down, and as I did, the lights flickered once, twice, before coming back to a steady glow. The elevator descended to the basement, where I was standing. I could hear the faint hum of machinery working somewhere above, but nothing about the elevator felt out of place. Until the doors slid open. I stepped inside, ready to inspect whatever malfunction was causing it to stop on a non-existent floor. The smell of stale air filled the small, confined space as I hit the button for the 3rd floor, curious to see if it had simply been a glitch in the system. As the doors slid shut, the small light above the panel blinked and then went dark. A strange feeling washed over me, the kind of feeling you get when you know something isn't right but you can't put your finger on it. The elevator jerked, the sound of its old mechanisms groaning in protest, but it started moving upwards. The ride felt longer than usual, and the air inside grew cooler, chilled, almost to the point of discomfort. The lights flickered again, casting harsh shadows across the walls. I tried to ignore the unsettling feeling crawling up my spine as I reached the 3rd floor, but when the doors opened, I froze. The hallway beyond was dark, too dark. The kind of dark that felt thick, heavy, like it was trying to swallow everything around it. There was no reason for the lights to be out on a floor that was supposed to be closed. I peered into the blackness, my breath catching in my throat. I was about to step out when the elevator doors suddenly slammed shut, trapping me inside. The lights blinked again, and the elevator lurched upwards with a violent jolt. My stomach dropped as it started to move between floors, its usual slow ascent now quick and erratic. I punched the emergency stop button, but nothing happened. The cold was unbearable now, seeping into my bones, and the metallic sound of the elevator's mechanics was joined by something else. A soft, scraping sound, almost like nails on a chalkboard, but deeper, throbbing. I swallowed hard. This wasn't right. The elevator jerked to a stop again, this time in complete darkness, the kind of silence that made every breath feel too loud. Panic began creeping in, but I forced myself to focus, pulling out my phone to use as a light. As the faint beam cut through the darkness, I noticed something odd. A set of old blueprints, rolled up, was lying on the floor near the corner of the elevator. I didn't remember it being there before. Curious and desperate to find some explanation, I bent down and unraveled the paper. It was a blueprint of the hospital, or at least it was supposed to be. As I traced the lines with my fingers, something stood out. A hidden ward. A room that didn't exist on any of the official plans. And it wasn't just a storage room or some old office space. The annotations on the blueprint described something far worse. It mentioned experimental treatments and observation rooms. Words that made my stomach twist as I skimmed through them. My heart hammered in my chest as I realized what this meant. The cold, the sounds, the malfunctioning elevator. Something had happened here, something the hospital wanted to forget. I turned back to the elevator's control panel, trying desperately to get it to move again, but it wouldn't respond. Then, the scraping sound returned. This time, it wasn't coming from the elevator walls. It was coming from behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing, just the empty darkness. My breath came in shallow gasps now, my hand shaking as I wiped the sweat off my brow. I had to get out. I had to get away from whatever was in that hidden ward, from whatever had been left behind. With a final desperate effort, I slammed my palm against the panel again. The elevator jolted to life, beginning its slow descent, and I gripped the sides to steady myself. When it finally reached the ground floor, I rushed out, running for the nearest exit, my heart still racing. I never spoke about what I'd found. No one would have believed me anyway. The hospital tried to keep everything under wraps. But every time I pass the North Tower, I can't help but feel the weight of what happened on the third floor. And every time I step into that elevator, I swear I hear the scraping sound again, just beneath the hum of the machinery. And I know, deep down, that something is still trapped in there. Something that never made it out. The Children's Medical Center was always a place of quiet intensity at night, but on April 12 at 4 a.m., the stillness of the ward felt different, heavier somehow. I leaned back against the nurse's station, the fluorescent lights humming above me, casting their cold glow over the stacks of charts and medication orders. The only sounds were the steady beeping of monitors and the occasional shuffle of footsteps. The night shifts had their rhythm, predictable in their quiet, their lack of movement. But as I stood there, the hum of the building seemed to pulse differently, as if something beneath the surface was shifting, pulling. It wasn't unusual for the children to wake in the night, restless from dreams or discomfort. Some cried out, some murmured, others would talk softly to imaginary friends. Kids in the hospital often had vivid imaginations, or perhaps it was the isolation that caused them to see things that weren't there. But lately, something had started to change. I couldn't put my finger on it at first, but the stories the children were telling had a tone to them, an undercurrent that felt different from the usual childish tales of adventure. "There's another kid in the mirror," one of the younger ones, Jamie, had whispered to me a few nights ago. He was a bright-eyed 6-year-old, though the hospital lights made his eyes look tired and hollow. "He's just standing there," he said, pointing to the mirror on the far wall of the ward. "He waves at me, but he's not real. He's just in the mirror." At first I thought it was just his imagination. Kids, after all, would often talk about the things they could see in their reflections. But over the next few nights, more and more of the children began mentioning something similar. Other kids in the mirror. Some even spoke of them by name, as if they knew who they were. There was something unsettling about the way they described it. They spoke of the reflections with a strange familiarity, as if the figures in the mirror were always there, waiting, not frightening, not threatening, but something else, something distant yet present. One night, as I walked through the ward on my usual rounds, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The air felt colder than usual, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. As I passed the large mirror mounted on the wall, I glanced into it. For a moment I saw nothing, just the faint reflection of the empty room behind me. But then I saw it. A child, standing just beyond the reflection of the door. She was looking directly at me, her face pale, her hair falling in loose waves around her shoulders. I froze, my heart thudding in my chest. The girl was wearing a hospital gown, the same pale blue as the ones the patients wore. I blinked, and the reflection changed. The girl was gone, replaced by the familiar image of the empty room. My breath came out in a rush. I told myself I must have imagined it. It was late, my eyes were tired, but deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. Something was wrong. The following nights only intensified the unease. Each child I spoke to seemed to have a story about the mirror. Some of them were too frightened to even look at it anymore, claiming they saw not just other children, but entire scenes, children playing in the reflection, laughing, running through fields that weren't in the room. Others said they saw the children staring back at them, mimicking their movements, as if they were trapped in the glass. Then came the night I could no longer ignore what was happening. It was past 3 in the morning when I made my rounds, checking on the last few patients before the shift would end. The ward was quieter now, the children asleep in their beds, some curled up tightly under the blankets. I passed by the mirror again, my eyes instinctively drawn to it. This time, there was no mistaking what I saw. In the reflection, there were 2 children, 2 figures I didn't recognize. One was a boy with dark, messy hair, his features sharp and defined, his eyes wide open but unseeing. The other was a girl, her skin pale, almost translucent, and her expression blank, as though she were frozen in place. They stood at the edge of the room, right next to a bed that wasn't occupied by any patient. I felt a chill run through me, and I turned to look behind me. The room was empty. The beds were all empty. I turned back to the mirror, but the children in the reflection were still there, their eyes fixed on me. They didn't move, they didn't blink, they just stared. It was in that moment that I heard the softest sound. A low, rasping breath, followed by a soft giggle, as though the children in the reflection were speaking to each other. My breath caught in my throat. I took a step closer to the mirror, compelled by something I couldn't explain. And as I did, the children's reflections started to shift. The boy moved closer, and the girl seemed to tilt her head, as if studying me. My pulse raced. I stepped back quickly, heart hammering in my chest. This wasn't right. I was used to the quiet oddities of the hospital, the things that came with caring for sick children. But this felt different. I could feel the weight of something pressing in from the edges of my consciousness, something I didn't want to confront. I left the ward that night with a gnawing unease that I couldn't shake, Over the next few days, I tried to ignore it, to convince myself that it was just my tired mind playing tricks. But I couldn't forget the mirror, the children in the reflection. I started asking around, quietly, under my breath. Some of the other nurses and doctors had heard the same stories, the kids seeing other children in the mirror. But nobody had a real explanation. It was just one of those things, they said, a phase the children were going through. But I couldn't let it go. I had to know more. So I went down to the hospital archives one evening when the building was quiet, the halls empty. The dusty files filled the shelves, the air thick with the smell of old paper. It was there that I found the file, the one marked Psychiatric Ward Mirror. The story was unsettling to say the least. The mirror had been salvaged from the psychiatric ward that had been demolished years ago to make room for the new wing. The psychiatric ward had been notorious for its high number of tragic events, for the patients who had never left, whose lives had ended under mysterious circumstances, and from the looks of the file, the mirror had been a part of it all. No one had ever mentioned this before, the connection between the children's reflections and the history of that ward. The more I read, the more the pieces began to fall into place. It seemed that the mirror had been something of a relic, its glass carrying with it the imprint of those who had once stood before it. The reflections weren't simply tricks of light or imagination. They were echoes, residual images from those who had passed through the walls of the ward, the ones who never left. That night I went back to the mirror. I stood before it, now understanding what I was seeing. The reflections weren't simply children. They were those lost in the shadows of the hospital's past, their images stuck in time. As I stared into the glass, I wondered how many of them were still there, waiting to be seen. The night was still, the kind of silence that could make even the hospital's hum feel unnaturally loud. It was just past 1 a.m, the kind of time when the world seems to pause. Except in places like this, where life is always rushing by, always teetering on the edge of a new beginning or a tragic end. I had just finished my rounds, making sure the mothers were comfortable, checking on the little ones, adjusting the temperature in the nursery. The lights were dimmed low in the maternity ward, a soft, constant glow from the overhead lamps, casting shadows across the rows of cribs. But there was one crib that stood out, an incubator, empty except for a clean white sheet, keeping it ready for when it would be needed. I was about to leave when I heard it. A soft sound, at first barely noticeable, like a faint, wavering cry. I froze, my hand still on the door handle, and listened. It came again. Clearer this time. A baby's cry. The desperate sound of a newborn still adjusting to the outside world. It wasn't coming from the cribs. It was coming from the empty incubator. I turned back, my heart skipping a beat. I glanced at the cribs, just to double check. Nothing. All the babies were sleeping peacefully, wrapped in their swaddles. No one was crying, but the sound persisted. I walked slowly toward the incubator, a strange chill creeping down my spine. There it was, coming from the clear glass. The incubator sat quietly, the gentle hum of the monitor just audible, but the cry, it was unmistakable. The sound of a newborn struggling for attention, needing something, reaching out with tiny, helpless wails. But there was no baby, just an empty, sterile space where one should have been. I stood there for a long moment, just staring at it. I couldn't explain it. My first thought was that I was overtired, maybe imagining things. But then something caught my eye. Handprints. Small, faint, almost translucent handprints smeared lightly across the glass. They weren't there before. At least, I was sure of it. I had checked the incubator just minutes ago. There were no marks, no prints, no sign of anything unusual. I pressed my palm against the glass, feeling the cool surface, searching for some sign that I was just being paranoid. But the handprints remained. The glass was pristine where I touched it, but the handprints on the other side lingered, as though someone or something had pressed its tiny hands against it from the inside. My mind raced. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding. Was someone playing a prank on me? A child, maybe? One of the mothers or a curious family member? No, it didn't feel like that. The sound of the crying, the faint, almost imperceptible marks on the glass, it all felt wrong. I turned to the monitor beside the incubator. It was an advanced piece of equipment designed to monitor every vital sign with accuracy. The screen flickered slightly, its usual steady readout interrupted by a spike. I blinked, thinking I'd misread it. I'd seen this machine 100 times before, but what it was showing now made no sense. The monitor flashed to life with a rapid sequence of numbers: heart rate, oxygen levels, blood pressure. All perfect, all stable, all far too calm for a newborn. But the problem was that there was no baby in the incubator. I stared at the screen, then back at the incubator. The cries had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that felt suffocating. The numbers on the monitor continued to pulse, as though trying to communicate something I couldn't understand. I was about to reach for the phone to call for help when the door to the ward opened, startling me. A colleague of mine, Claire, walked in, her face drawn and tired, but with a concerned look when she saw me standing by the incubator, staring at the screen. "Everything okay?" she asked, her voice still thick with sleep. I blinked, shaking myself out of my trance. "There's something wrong," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. That incubator. It's empty, but it's showing readings, and I swear I heard a baby cry." Claire stepped closer, a knowing look crossing her face. She leaned in, glancing at the monitor, then at the incubator. I could tell she was about to say something when her expression changed, her eyes widening just a bit, just enough for me to notice. "What's wrong?" I asked, my stomach tightening. She hesitated, glancing around the room as if making sure no one else was listening. You didn't notice the plaque, did you?" she asked quietly. I turned to look, confused. There had always been a small plaque on the side of the incubator near the base, but I had never paid much attention to it before. I leaned in closer, squinting at the faint engraving on the metal. It was almost impossible to make out, but it said something about an accident that had occurred here decades ago. The words hit me like a cold wave. I'd heard the stories before. Everyone in the hospital had. The hospital had been built on the site of an old maternity ward, one that had been in use for nearly a century. Decades ago, a tragic accident had occurred in this very room, at this very incubator. A newborn had died in the middle of the night, something no one could explain. A mechanical failure? Human error? No one knew for sure, but there had been rumors, strange occurrences, whispers of things left unfinished, unhealed. I stepped back, my knees feeling weak. Claire must have seen the horror in my face because she spoke again, her voice barely audible. "There are stories, you know," she said, her voice almost too quiet for comfort. "They say that baby never left." I looked at the incubator, then at the monitor, and I understood. The baby hadn't been there, but somehow its presence was. Somehow, after all these years, it had come back in a way I couldn't understand. The handprints on the glass, the cries in the silence, the monitor's readings, they were all part of something deeper, something older. I turned slowly toward Claire, my thoughts racing. "What do you mean? I never left." But by the time I turned back to the incubator, the monitor had gone silent. The glass was clean, the handprints were gone. And yet I could still hear the faintest sound, the soft cry of a baby, somewhere in the distance. The hum of the MRI machine was a comforting monotony, one I'd grown accustomed to over years of late shifts. The soft glow of the control room screens kept the edges of fatigue at bay, but tonight the air felt off. Halloween nights in the hospital had a way of amplifying the strange. Pranks, odd coincidences, even the occasional urban legend whispered among nurses on smoke breaks. I chalked it up to exhaustion and turned back to my monitor, watching the seconds tick by until the end of my shift. The scanner room was empty, its lights dimmed to conserve energy. Scheduled maintenance meant the machine wasn't in use tonight, giving me a rare reprieve from the usual string of patients. The silence in the adjoining control room should have been welcome, but it wasn't. There was an almost imperceptible hum, deeper than the usual ambient noise, a vibration, low and rhythmic, that seemed to come from the walls themselves. It started faintly, a flicker on the interface panel, just a single light pulsing in time with the vibration. The screen above it flickered briefly, displaying a diagnostic run that hadn't been initiated. I froze, unsure if it was a glitch or some automated process I'd forgotten about. But then, the unmistakable sound of the scanner engaging filled the control room. A hollow thump as the magnet powered up and the coils began their cycle. I pushed back from my chair, half expecting to see someone in the scanner room playing a prank, but the room was empty. No one was scheduled to be in there. I clicked into the control panel, hands unsteady as I tried to shut the machine down remotely. Nothing responded. The scanner was moving on its own, its gantry rotating slowly, like a predator surveying its surroundings. The interface displayed a sequence of commands I hadn't input, the text scrolling faster than I could follow. Then came the images. They populated the screen in bursts, static-filled at first but growing clearer with each cycle. Shapes, indistinct at first, began to emerge. A hand, elongated and crooked. A face. Or what should have been a face, warped and stretched, with hollow pits where eyes belonged. I blinked, convinced it was a malfunction. But the images kept coming, each more detailed than the last, until they began to look deliberate. I leaned closer to the screen, my breath shallow as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The features in the scans weren't human. Bones didn't curve like that. Limbs didn't bend at those angles. It was impossible, grotesque. And yet the machine kept capturing it frame by frame. A sudden crash from the scanner room jolted me. I whipped around, staring through the observation window. The table inside had shifted, its edges scraping against the floor. The lights flickered once, twice, before stabilizing. I couldn't see anyone inside, but the air seemed heavier, thicker. as though the room itself was holding its breath. The sound of static hissed through the intercom. My heart hammered as I reached for the switch, half expecting to hear a garbled voice. Instead, there was a low, guttural noise, a sound that didn't belong in any hospital. It was deep and resonant, vibrating through the walls like a pulse. Gosh, I should have left right then. Should have called security or anyone else to deal with this. But something compelled me to stay, to watch. The machine wasn't just scanning, it was searching. And whatever it was searching for, it had found. The final image filled the screen, perfectly clear. It was a figure, humanoid, but wrong in every conceivable way. Its limbs were too long, its torso twisted. Its face was featureless, save for a mouth that stretched impossibly wide. I stared at it, transfixed, as the lights dimmed further, casting the room in shadow. Then the alarm started, low at first, then shrill and unrelenting. The scanner's gantry began to shake violently, and the table lifted on its own, hovering several inches off the ground. A cold draft swept through the control room, chilling me to the bone. I staggered back, knocking over my chair. The figure in the image wasn't confined to the screen anymore. It was there, in the scanner room. I saw it flicker into existence like a projection, its distorted form rippling as though it were fighting to stay tethered to this plane. The realization hit me like a thunderclap. The machine wasn't malfunctioning. It was acting as a conduit. The hospital had been built over what the locals called the cursed grounds, a burial site disturbed decades ago during construction. Rumors of unexplained phenomena had circulated for years, dismissed as superstition. But the stories were real. The machine had tapped into something it shouldn't have, awakening a presence that had lain dormant for centuries. I stumbled toward the emergency shutoff panel, slamming my palm against it. The lights in the scanner room flared, blindingly bright, before plunging into darkness. The hum ceased, replaced by an oppressive silence. For a moment, I thought it was over, but the figure wasn't gone. It stood there, fully formed now, on the other side of the observation window, its eyeless gaze fixed on me. As we wrap up these chilling hospital horror stories, I hope you found yourself on the edge of your seat. These eerie accounts remind us that even the most sterile places can harbor dark secrets. If you've enjoyed this spine-tingling journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. More unsettling stories are coming your way soon. And always remember, not everything you see in the hospital is as it seems. Stay cautious and never ignore your instincts